Hello, it's Scott Nicholson, Associate Professor from Syracuse University School of Information Studies, and I'm here with session number 10 in the Gaming and Libraries course. And what I'm going to talk about today are the library game experience archetypes. Now again, today we're going to be using some slides, so here I go. Whee! Anyway, this is the model that we developed last time about the library game experiences. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight 5 parts of this model and use that to build up 5 archetypes for library game experiences. And this is going to be the structure that we're going to use to talk about games over the next week of class. Now, the first thing I'm going to talk about are knowledge games. Now, if you notice, one part of the model is the external knowledge that the players bring to the table. And there are some types of games that use that knowledge. And so that's going to be, we're going to call that a knowledge archetype. So let's talk a little bit about this. Now, what I'm going to do, just so you know, next week, I'm going to be talking a lot about each of these types. I'll have an episode on each type. So I'll just talk a little bit about each one now, but I'll have a whole episode on each type with some specific recommendations for games that bring about that type. So knowledge games are things like educational games, trivia games, game shows, games that test a person's external knowledge that they brought to the table. They're really well suited for school and academic libraries. They match up well to the missions of those libraries. Things like a summer reading program that's on the topic, that can work really well to test knowledge. They're very easy to justify. You know, people playing a knowledge-based game is easy to justify in a library setting. They can be they're very competitive. Usually these games are about people demonstrating their knowledge. Now, if an educational game might be set up to where you learn, then you demonstrate. But they are competitive. They reward certain types of players who enjoy more intellectual challenges like these kinds of games. Now, these also tend to be the same sort of people that like other library services, and that's why this type of game can work fairly well in a library setting. They also work well in team activities, where you have groups of people together working on questions. And this is where you can mix age groups. If you put children and adults and seniors together on teams and ask them questions, a variety of questions, not just pop culture, but a variety of things, you'll get to see that different age groups will stand out for different types of questions. So that's the knowledge game archetype. And again, I'll have a whole episode on this next week. Now, the next type of game is a strategy game archetype. So the strategy game archetype is for players who enjoy game experiences where they're working to change the game state, where they're making those decisions about what should change about the game state. And that's what they like to challenge, their ability to plan and figure out, well, what needs to change in the game state. These are the strategy games. So some examples of this would be chess and board and card games and war games. A number of computer games work well as strategy game archetypes. These games have a long history of libraries. Chess has been around since the 1850s. You know, strategy games have been in libraries for some space, and because of that, they're fairly easy to justify within a library setting. They're a quieter game experience. Most strategy games tend to be some people thinking more than anything else, and so therefore they fit well if you need to have a quieter game. They teach a lot of skills, things like planning and decision-making and economics if it's a game that has resources that you're trading or purchasing. And they teach a lot of real-life skills. So while the knowledge games test this external knowledge of the real world, strategy games allow you to develop a lot of real-life skills. And because of that, they are fairly easy to justify even in an academic setting. A school library, for example, can justify the sort of real-life skills that are developed through strategy games. They reward thinking players who like to think and process. That's who enjoys these types of games. But they're not very good for team activities because with a strategy game, if you get a team together, they're going to have to spend a lot of time debating what actions to take. And so they don't tend to work as well as other types of games for teams. Now, they also are slower. They're more involved. They're not as flashy. So they're going to be longer experiences. Longer games where people get more involved with them. They're not going to be all bright and shiny like a video game. Now, there are some video games that do have strategy elements in it. The puzzle games, the civilization games, and things like that are about strategy. But in general, those are even less flashy than other types of gaming experiences. The next is the action game experience. Now this emphasizes players' ability to change the game state. Now again, that difference between strategy and action. Strategy is I decide what I want to do and I can do it. Action is, well, I decide what I want to do, but the emphasis is on my ability to do it. So like in Dance Dance Revolution, for example, okay, I see an arrow moving up the screen, and I decide I want to step on the up at the right time. But the game is really all about my ability to step on the pad at the time when the arrow hits the top of the screen. So if you wanted to take chess, for example, as a strategy game, there's no action element. If I decide I want to move my pawn up 2 spaces, then that's what I get to do. Even if along the way I knock some things over or I make a mistake, and screw up, we fix that because it's about what I intended to do. Now, we could play chess where you have to use a blowgun to shoot the pieces and make the pieces move. Now, that would be adding an action element. And in many action games, the action part is more important than the strategy. I may know in a Zelda game that, hey, I really want to jump over there, hit the thing with my sword, grab the rope, swing over there, land, and save the princess. I understand those are the actions I need to take. But it's about my ability to take those actions. And so that's what action games are about. Now, action game examples focus on dexterity or hand-eye coordination or reflexes. Mostly they're video games and electronic games, but there are also other types of analog games that are action games. Things like shuffleboard and dexterity games, where you can make plans, but it's all about your ability to carry out those plans. There's some computer games or action games, and not too many analog, but there's some. They're very flashy. If you're looking for game experiences that draw people over, action games do that because they're very visceral. They get you involved. People are involved. People are doing things. They tend to be fast-paced. Many of them have a time element. Not all, but many have a time element that comes into play. Many of them tend to be loud, very exciting. And so if you're looking to draw over, action game experiences can be good ones. They are very good for public libraries supporting recreation. They're not as good for a school library trying to support a curriculum because the skills that action games develop, while they do develop some skills, hand-eye coordination and things like that, the skills don't necessarily map with what libraries are trying to do. They're a great draw for younger demographics. This is why many libraries are using things like Dance Dance Revolution and Rock Band and things like that for teens, because that action game archetype works well to draw in that particular demographic. They can be very hard to justify. So you need to be careful before you start taking games for an action game experience to make sure you can justify why you're choosing those things. We're going to use these archetypes later on and tie them back to how you justify gaming in your libraries, all the way back to the library mission. But what it comes down to is that if you can't justify why you're doing what you're doing, then you need to be careful and perhaps choose a different type of game. Now, the next type are narrative game experiences. Now, narrative game experiences are those that focus on the game world in which we're playing the game. So things like role-playing games where we're telling a story in this world. Many big games have you set in there. A summer reading game, for example, you have a summer reading game where you ask kids to come dressed up as one of the characters from their favorite book over the summer reading experience. And then they're going to all work together to solve some challenges through a storytelling activity. That's a narrative game. There's also board games that are narrative games. There's a flavor of board game which focuses more on the theme and less on the mechanics, and more on the world that's going on. War games and battle games can fall into this narrative category as well. Again, if the idea is that you're going to be immersed in that story and you need to be immersed in that story, then it's a narrative game experience. Narrative games are the closest to traditional literacy concepts. Many of these narrative games require reading and writing. They have you interacting with each other in a storytelling way. They tie in very well into a library looking to work on literacy through gaming. The narrative games are good for long-term repeated sessions because they're involved. They have a world that's going on. They're good if you have long time to play a game or you want to continue a game from session to session. Narrative games work very well for that because it's the continuation of a story. All ages can engage with these things, but these sorts of games require commitment. They're much harder to pick up and get involved with. Something like Dance Dance Revolution doesn't require you to get involved in the backstory of it to just jump on the pads. Even something like World of Warcraft doesn't really require you to get involved in the backstory of it. You have a quest to do something. There's this long text. You can just scroll to it, see you need 10 elf ears, click accept, go out to get the 10 elf ears, come back, get your loot. That's what you can do. Even though there's all this backstory, you really don't have to read any of it. So a narrative game experience is how much do the players need to become engaged with the narrative to enjoy the game, to be able to succeed at the game. Narrative games, many of them are not as competitive, but they can focus on teamwork. So in a role-playing game, for example, everyone's together on a team. They can take a lot of time to prepare, but they can be the most rewarding and engaging game archetypes. Someone that gets involved with the stories there at the library really can get engaged. And because of the tie into literacy, these can tie into other library resources very easily for the narrative game experience. They can be useful in building up a really loyal core of people who are coming there time and time again. These narrative game experiences work well for that. And the final type is a social. Now, social game experiences focus on these social interactions, and both types, either social interactions that come because the game forces you to have them, or social interactions that come because you're having them with each other, not necessarily related to the game, but the game sets up situations where you can interact with each other. So these social game experiences, many party games fall into this category. A lot of Wii games fall into the category. Wii Sports, for example, it's more of a social game than anything else. And the reason why I say that is because the action abilities in Wii Sports are really not very precise. Gamers can get very frustrated with Wii Sports because, you know, if you've ever played Wii Tennis, you wave the Wiimote and the figure kind of swings, and it really doesn't take a lot of hand-eye coordination, and it doesn't reward skill, and you can miss when you really should be hitting. And so because of that, it's more about the social interactions as it's creating. This is best. Social games are great when the library's goal is to be a community hub. When you're trying to have games where people will get to know each other, social games work well. Competition is not so important in the social games, although there will be people that will always be focused on the competition element. But it's more about engagement with each other. You're trying to facilitate that engagement. Social games work really well for crossing demographic boundaries because, again, they're about getting to know each other and not so much about testing your skill or testing your strategy or testing your knowledge. They're more about having that interaction with each other. They can be noisy, and so that may be a concern for you, and they're not as good for shy players. If you have someone that really doesn't want to get engaged, they may not enjoy the social. But if you have a team game where shy players can team up with more outgoing players, they can work together, that can actually be a way of bringing the shy players along into a social experience. So, this brings me to the snacks gaming archetypes. So snacks, because you always have to have snacks with games. So snacks, S-N-A-K-S, help you remember the 5 archetypes: strategy, narrative, action, knowledge, and social. And the idea is that you're going to pick an archetype based upon your library goals. And then you're going to pick games based upon the archetype that you picked. And that lets you justify the games back to the goals of the library. Now, just so that in case you're thinking, well, Scott, there are games out there like Wii Sports, you know, that's both action and social. And yes, most games actually will fit multiple archetypes. And the idea here is that if the library only has limited resources, which they do, then you want to pick games that match up to a number of different archetypes. Now, some games, like there's a Wii game called Boom Blocks, which has a number of different modes of play. And depending upon the mode you play, it can be a more strategic game or it can be a bit more action game. And so there are some games that let you play them in different ways to bring out different elements. Now, something like a team first-person shooter game where you have a group of people all running around a maze, but they're on teams together. Well, that brings together the action and the strategy because while you have to have the ability to do well, it's also the strategy of how your team works together comes into play. Something called a real-time strategy game is another way to bring strategy and action together because you're making plans about running a world. And so I've got to send armies over there and armies over here, and it's about my strategy, but I also have to have the physical ability to move and scan the battlefield quickly. Party games, many of them test social and knowledge. So it's a combination of both. You have that external knowledge being tested, but it's being done in a social environment. Live action role-playing games have you both doing narration with each other, but also the social elements come into play because you're going to have a story, but then you may also have these other team-type elements that are happening. Console role-playing games have both the narrative and the action elements, or something like Diablo, for example, had narrative elements as well as action elements. Although with many role-playing games, you don't have to get engaged with the narrative to play the game. It's really a strategy or an action game. So these are just some examples of how you can mix these things up together. But the idea here that I want you to take away is it's not a one-to-one match between archetype and game. Instead, you pick an archetype, and then once you know the archetype, it's going to be much easier to go out and select the appropriate games. The final part I'm going to talk about with the archetypes are these overlays. Now, these are some decisions that apply across the archetypes. Is this going to be an open play activity, or are you going to have some sort of a tournament? So you're going to let people just come in and play with the stuff, or are they actually going to compete? Are people going to play as single players? Are they going to play as a team? They come as a team, or are they going to be placed on teams? Rock Band, for example, works really well for people to come as a team and play as a band against other teams, while there are many other team games that can work well as icebreaker activities. Is it going to happen once, or is it going to happen many times? Because if the game is a more in-depth game or a longer game, then you're going to have it set up so that it'll happen over a series of sessions. Or is it a shorter game, you can get engaged, you can take care of it and play it in one sitting. What's the role of chance? I'll talk about this later, but the idea is that chance mitigates skill. A game with more chance allows a less skillful player to beat a more skillful player. So you have to decide how much chance are you going to have in the games that you put out there. And finally, and I'll talk again, I'll have a session on this later, the concept of play versus creation. Is it a time where you're coming together to just play the game, or is it a session where you're coming together to create the game? All of these archetypes work with these overlays. They all interact with each other. And so over the next 5 sessions, I'm going to be talking about each one of those 5 archetypes more in depth and giving you some specific examples. And I'll talk about these overlays as well in context with each of the 5 archetypes. So this sets the context for really the majority of the rest of the class and how it's going to be organized. And I guess I'll have my cheap plug now. I'm writing a book about all of this too. What you're getting here in these lessons is a small part of what is going to go into a book that I'm writing. It should be out in 2010 called Everyone Plays at the Library. It's going to be published by Information Today, and this concept I'm presenting here is the structure for that book, and I'm going to go a lot more in detail in the book. But in the next 5 sessions of this class, you're going to learn more about what sort of games work well, what sort of goals apply to these different archetypes, and how to use the archetypes in making library decisions. So, I think that's enough for now. Thank you much, and I'll talk to you later. Oh, by the way, if you like this class, please let someone else know about it, because the idea is to get the word out. So tell someone, point someone to it. You can talk about the class online over at ALA Connect. Thanks a lot. I'll talk to you later.